What happens when people decide they've just had enough of the person in charge? Especially when that person is, a king, believes they rule because God says so. It's pretty dramatic stuff, isn't it?
It really is. It's the ultimate challenge to how things are run, a moment where everything gets shaken up.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what this deep dive is all about today. We're digging into some seriously intense moments in English history, and actually beyond, where people properly pushed back against the monarch's power. It's a massive theme, especially for power and the people.
hmm These weren't just dusty old events. They were real, messy struggles. Fights over religion, money, control. Who really held the power? They completely shaped Britain, and, well, their impacts spread way further, too.
Right, so buckle up because we're going on a bit of a journey. Centuries of defiance, starting with the king taking on the Pope himself.
Through rebellions, right here.
Oh, yeah. And revolution, civil war.
Mm.
All the way to a whole new country starting up across the Atlantic. Let's get into how challenging royal authority played out in some really gripping ways. Okay, let's kick things off with maybe England's most famous king, Henry VIII. Everyone knows about the six wives.
Yeah, that tends to stick. But it was his personal life, specifically wanting that divorce from Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, that really lit the fuse for something massive.
And it landed smack bang in the middle of all this other change happening across Europe, right? The Reformation.
Exactly. People like Martin Luther were already questioning the Catholic Church, its power, its wealth, how it did things.
Like selling indulgences, paying to get sins forgiven. People were starting to think, hang on.
Right. And the Bible, only being in Latin, most ordinary people couldn't read it. So the church controlled everything you learned about faith. These protesters, they got called Protestants.
But the really interesting thing about Henry is he wasn't on their side to begin with, was he?
Not at all. He was super devout Catholic initially. The Pope even gave him a title, Defender of the Faith, for writing against Luther.
So what made him do a complete U-turn? Obviously the divorce and wanting a son and heir.
That was key. But the sources also point to the church's power in England and its incredible wealth. Think about it. The monasteries owned about a quarter of all the land. Henry saw an opportunity.
Ah, okay. So challenging the Pope wasn't just about getting remarried.
No, it was about power and money, too. Big time. He could grab control and all that wealth for himself, for the crown.
And he did it properly, with a law, the Act of Supremacy in 1534.
Yes, no messing about. It declared him, Henry VIII, the supreme head of the Church of England. Just like that.
Wow. So that just snipped the connection with the Pope after centuries.
Completely gone. England was now officially a Protestant country, but, crucially, under the king's authority, not Rome's.
But that must have caused chaos. People wouldn't have just accepted it, surely.
Absolutely not. Huge divisions. Really devout Catholics, like his own former advisor Thomas More, couldn't accept it. More refused to take the oath, acknowledging Henry as head of the church.
And he was executed for it.
He was. And there were real fears other Catholic countries in Europe might invade England. It was a massive, risky move.
And those religious changes Henry forced through, they didn't just cause ripples abroad, did they? They led to a major rebellion right here. The Pilgrimage of Grace.
That's right. This wasn't just a few angry villagers. It was a huge uprising, spread right across the north of England, tens of thousands of people involved.
Why? What pushed them to actually rebel?
Well, religion was absolutely at the heart of it. For centuries, their whole lives, their communities, had revolved around the Catholic faith. Henry's changes felt like he was tearing apart the very fabric of their world.
And closing the monasteries. That wasn't just symbolic, was it?
Not at all. These places were vital. They provided charity, basic health care, food for the poor, shelter for travelers. They were like the medieval welfare state in some ways. Shutting them down, which Henry and his minister Thomas Cromwell were doing partly to get their hands on their money and land.
Oh, it's real hardship and anger.
Exactly. Plus, you had other grumbles, rising food prices, some local landowners feeling ignored by Cromwell down in London. It all sort of boiled over together.
The sources mentioned two main phases, right? One in Lincolnshire, then a much bigger one in Yorkshire, led by a lawyer, Robert S.
Yes, the Yorkshire one was the big one. Huge scale. Over 50,000 people apparently took the Pilgrim's Oath. They swore to defend the Catholic faith. You had lords, knights, ordinary farmers all marching together. They took control of major places like York and Pontefract Castle.
So Henry must have been worried.
He was definitely in a tricky spot. His army, led by the Duke of Norfolk, was actually outnumbered up there.
Yeah.
So Norfolk had to talk to them.
And he made promises.
Seemed to. Pardons for everyone involved, a stop to closing monasteries, maybe even a parliament held in York to discuss their concerns. The rebels believed him, trusted the king's word, and went home. Askew went down to London, met Henry, spent Christmas at court.
But it was a trick.
Completely. Henry never intended to keep those promises. While Aske was being entertained, more royal troops were heading north. Then some rebels got impatient, started some small attacks again.
And Henry used that as his excuse.
Exactly. He unleashed a brutal crackdown, revenge.
Yeah.
Around 216 leaders were executed. Robert Aske was hanged in chains from the walls of York Castle, a really gruesome public warning.
So this massive challenge, what did it actually achieve in the end?
Religiously, nothing really. The monasteries stayed shut. In fact, they were all eventually closed down, making Henry incredibly rich. The Pope wasn't brought back.
But politically, did it weaken Henry?
Quite the opposite. By crushing the rebellion so ruthlessly, he showed everyone who was boss. He tightened his grip, especially on the north, setting up the Council of the North to keep things under control. There were no more major rebellions like that while he was king.
So the lesson there is, even a massive popular uprising can be defeated if the ruler is powerful enough and, well, ruthless enough.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
It showed the limits of challenging Henry's authority directly. He wasn't going to tolerate it.
Okay, let's jump forward now. Over a century later, different dynasty, the Stuarts. And if Henry faced challenges, Charles I, well, he faced total meltdown, didn't he? This was the biggest crisis the English monarchy had ever seen.
Absolutely. Charles I comes to the throne in 1625. His dad, James I, had already had run-ins with Parliament.
Yeah, tensions were already there.
But Charles ramped it up massively. He was a huge believer in the divine right of kings.
That's the idea that God put him on the throne, so he only had to answer to God, not Parliament, not the people.
Exactly. And that idea just clashed fundamentally with Parliament. They felt they had rights, especially about raising taxes. Charles didn't agree. So in 1629, he just dissolved Parliament, sent them home.
And ruled without them. For how long?
11 years. His opponents called it the 11 years of tyranny.
Wow. 11 years. How did things eventually break down so badly it led to war? What were the triggers?
It was a real mix. Religious fears were massive, political arguments about who had the right to rule, and economic problems, how the king was raising money. It all built up over those 11 years.
Okay, let's unpack that. Religion first. England's officially Protestant, but lots of people were deeply anti-Catholic. And Charles, well, his wife, Henrietta Maria, was Catholic.
Which made lots of people suspicious. Was the king secretly sympathetic? Was he planning to bring Catholicism back? Then his archbishop, William Laud, starts bringing in changes to church services. Things like fancy robes, altar rails. Stuff that felt very Catholic to many Protestants.
Especially the Puritans. They were quite strict Protestants, weren't they? And influential in Parliament.
Very influential. They were horrified. Saw it as popery creeping back in. And when 3 Puritan writers criticized these changes,
Charles used his special court, the Star Chamber, to punish them.
brutally. Pilloried, ears cut off, faces branded, but it backfired. Huge crowds turned out to support them. They became heroes, martyrs for the cause.
And the religious tension spilled over into Scotland, too.
Yes, Charles tried to force a new English-style prayer book on the Presbyterian Scots. They absolutely refused, signed a national agreement, the covenant to resist it. Charles sent an army, but the Scots beat them. Then the Scots invaded the north of England.
Okay, so the king needs money to fight the Scots, which means...
He has to call Parliament back. In 1640, he needs their cash.
But that didn't go well either. The short Parliament?
He dissolved it after just 3 weeks. They started listing their complaints, demanding changes before they'd grant any money. But the Scots were still sitting in northern England, demanding money too. So Charles was forced to call Parliament again later that same year. This one became known as the Long Parliament. They weren't going away quietly this time.
And then things got even more complicated with a rebellion in Ireland.
A Catholic rebellion, yes.
Yeah,
Again, rumors flew, was Charles secretly backing the rebels. Parliament agreed to raise an army to crush the Irish rebellion, but, and this is crucial, they refused to let Charles control that army. Zero trust.
Parliament kept criticizing him, didn't they? Published a list of complaints, the Grand Remonstrance.
They did. And Charles's reaction, utterly disastrous.
Yes.
He marched into the House of Commons with soldiers to arrest 5 of his main critics, including John Pym, who wrote the Remonstrance.
He tried to arrest MPs inside Parliament itself.
Yes. They'd been tipped off and escaped, but the damage was done. For many people, that act proved Charles was a tyrant, willing to use force against Parliament itself.
So religion, politics, And you mentioned money problems. During the 11 years without parliament.
He had to get money somehow, so he used old, unpopular methods. The most famous one was ship money.
What was that?
Traditionally, it was a tax paid only by coastal towns in wartime to fund the navy. Charles started demanding it from everyone, all counties, inland too, and during peacetime.
People must have been furious.
They were, refused to pay, and you could end up in prison. There was a famous court case in 1637. John Hampden refused to pay. He lost the case, narrowly, but he became another symbol of resistance against the king just taking money without Parliament's consent.
Right, so you've got this perfect storm brewing, religious paranoia, a king who thinks he's above the law, parliament pushing back, and really unpopular taxes.
Exactly. It shows how a ruler completely unwilling to compromise, convinced of his own God-given right, can push things to breaking point when faced with the religious fears, political demands, and economic anger. Something had to give.
And in 1642, it did. The tension finally snapped. Charles raised his battle standard at Nottingham. The English Civil War had begun.
And the country split. You had the Cavaliers, the Royalists fighting for the king. Often landowners, gentry, supported the existing hierarchy. Strongest support tended to be in the north and west.
Against the Roundheads, the parliamentarians, lots of merchants, traders, Puritans, people angry about taxes and the king's actions. Their power base was more in the south, especially London.
It was incredibly divisive. Families split, neighbors fought neighbors. A truly brutal conflict. The first few years were quite evenly matched, really. Back and forth.
Until someone really shook things up. Oliver Cromwell.
Oliver Cromwell. He was an MP, a strong Puritan, and he became a key military leader for Parliament. But his big contribution was rethinking the army itself.
The new model army.
Exactly. Formed in 1645. This was different. Britain's first properly professional national army. Disciplined, well-trained, often very devout Protestants who believed they were fighting God's cause. They were paid regularly too, which helped morale.
And the key thing was how you got promoted.
Yes. Based on ability, on merit. Not just because you were from a posh family. That was revolutionary.
And did it make a difference on the battlefield?
Huge difference. The Battle of Naseby, June 1645. That was the new model army's first major test. They absolutely smashed the king's main remaining army. It was the decisive turning point of the First War. Parliament was now clearly winning.
So after Naseby, Parliament gradually took control of the remaining royalist areas. And Charles?
Charles was eventually captured by the Scots, who then handed him over to Parliament in 1647.
Game over then.
You'd think so. Charles, even as a prisoner, couldn't stop scheming. He secretly did a deal with the Scots, promised to establish Presbyterianism in England if they invaded England for him against Parliament.
Seriously, while he was Parliament's prisoner?
Yes. The Scots invaded in 1648, starting the Second Civil War.
But they lost.
They were defeated fairly quickly by Cromwell and the new model army at the Battle of Preston. But Charles's double dealing, trying to restart the war, that was the final straw for many in the army and Parliament. They decided he could never be trusted. Negotiation was off the table. He had to face justice.
So the Civil War teaches us, well, partly that military organization matters. A professional army can change everything.
Definitely. Innovation, discipline, motivation. The new model army had all three, and it proved decisive when things were deadlocked.
And that decision that Charles couldn't be trusted, it led to something totally unprecedented, didn't it? Putting a king on trial.
Unprecedented and hugely controversial. After the Second Civil War, with Charles captured again, the army was furious. What do you do with a king who keeps starting wars?
How did they even arrange a trial? Parliament wasn't united, was it?
No. So in December 1648, Colonel Pride and his soldiers surrounded Parliament. They physically prevented MPs who still wanted to negotiate with the king from entering. Pride's Purge, it's called.
So only the anti-Charles MPs were left.
Essentially, yes. What remained was called the Rump Parliament. And they passed an act setting up a High Court of Justice to try Charles Stuart for treason against the people of England.
Treason against his own people? That's a radical idea. Was the trial seen as legitimate?
Deeply debated. Even some who'd fought against him felt it wasn't legal. Only 68 of the 135 judges appointed actually showed up. Cromwell was reportedly determined, though, supposed to have said, "I will cut off his head with the crown upon it."
What was Charles's defense?
He refused to plead guilty or not guilty. He basically said, "You have no authority to try me. A king cannot be tried by his subjects. Parliament cannot be prosecutor, judge, and jury.
But they rejected that.
Completely. They heard witnesses who blamed him for starting the wars, for all the bloodshed and suffering. No witnesses were called in his defense. The outcome was pretty much decided. He was found guilty on January 27, 1649, sentenced to death.
And the execution.
Just 3 days later, January 30th, 1649. Publicly, outside the banqueting house in Whitehall, London, the King of England was beheaded.
Wow. The impact must have been immense.
Earth-shattering. England was declared a republic, the Commonwealth. No more monarchy, no more House of Lords. Oliver Cromwell emerged as the most powerful figure, eventually becoming Lord Protector. He was even offered the crown later, but turned it down.
Cromwell himself, he's still a really divisive figure, isn't he? People see him very differently.
Absolutely. The sources show these contrasts clearly. On one hand, admired for his military skill, defeating the Dutch and Spanish, seen by some as a hero who got rid of a tyrant, pushed towards greater religious freedom for some groups, maybe even democracy.
But on the other hand,
Criticized heavily. He imposed strict Puritan rules, closing pubs, banning Christmas celebrations enforced by army officers called major generals. He ruthlessly crushed radical groups like the Levelers who wanted more equality. His campaign in Ireland involved massacres and is still incredibly controversial. And, ironically, critics accused him of ruling like a king himself, just without the title.
so getting rid of a king, it doesn't automatically solve everything. It creates new problems, new questions about power.
Definitely. It leaves a massive gap. Who rules now?
Yeah.
How? By one or right. And the person who fills that gap, like Cromwell, is always going to be viewed very differently depending on who you ask and how his rule affected them.
Okay, let's switch focus dramatically now. Big jump across the Atlantic Ocean. How did these ideas about challenging kings play out over there in Britain's own colonies?
Well, by the mid-1700s, you had these 13 British colonies strung along the east coast of North America, population around 2.5 million, including many enslaved people. They'd been established since the 1600s.
And over that time, the connection back to Britain, it weakened.
It did. Generations grew up who'd never seen Britain. They felt American, not just British colonists. They started to feel they could manage their own affairs, and they really began to resent being governed, and especially taxed, by a government thousands of miles away.
What were the long-term causes of that resentment building up?
Well, that sense of separate identity was key. Also, after Britain defeated France in the Seven Years' War in 1763, many colonists felt they didn't really need British military protection anymore. The French threat was gone.
But Britain had spent a fortune winning that war.
Exactly. And they decided the colonists should help pay for it through taxes. And that was the absolute flashpoint. The colonists went ballistic. Why? Because they had absolutely no elected representatives in the British Parliament that was taxing them.
No taxation without representation. That famous phrase.
That became the rallying cry. It summed up the core issue being taxed without having any say in it.
Were there other economic complaints too?
Oh, yes. Things like the Navigation Acts, which forced them to trade mainly with Britain, buy British goods, even if foreign stuff was cheaper or better. Then came specific taxes that caused uproar, like the Stamp Act in 1765, on paper, documents, newspapers, legal papers, even playing cards. That led to riots.
And then things started getting violent.
Increasingly so. Short-term triggers really escalated things. You had the Boston Massacre in 1770. British soldiers fired into a crowd, killed 5 colonists, huge anger, massive funeral processions. Then the Boston Tea Party in 1773, colonists disguised as Native Americans dumped a whole shipload of taxed tea into the harbor in protest.
How did Britain react to that?
Harshly. They passed laws the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, including closing the port of Boston until the tea was paid for. This just inflamed things more. And then, Lexington, 1775, British troops tried to seize colonial militia gunpowder supplies. Shots were fired. That's usually seen as the first battle of the American War of Independence.
So facing a British government that wouldn't budge on representation, the colonies decided to unite.
They did. They had already started coordinating. They appointed George Washington, a Virginia landowner with military experience, to lead a continental army. And in 1776, representatives from all 13 colonies met in Philadelphia.
And produced the Declaration of Independence.
A truly revolutionary document. It declared the 13 colonies were now free and independent states, completely separate from Britain.
And it laid out some pretty radical ideas about government.
Absolutely. Ideas from Enlightenment thinkers. That people have inalienable rights that can't be taken away, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happinesses. Crucially, it said governments get their power from the consent of the governed. And if a government becomes tyrannical,
The people have the right to change it or get rid of it.
exactly, to alter or abolish it. a direct challenge to monarchy and the idea of ruling without the people's agreement.
Declaring independence is one thing. Winning a war against the British Empire is another. How did they manage it?
It was tough. The colonists had militias, citizen soldiers against professional British troops. Britain won many early battles, but the colonists had determination, Washington's leadership, and they knew the territory.
And they got help.
Crucial help. France saw a chance to get revenge on Britain for past defeats. They poured in money, sent troops, and crucially sent their navy. French support was probably decisive.
Was there a key battle that finished it?
The Siege of Yorktown in 1781. The main British army in the south, under General Cornwallis, got tracked by American and French forces on land, and the French Navy blocked any escape by sea. Cornwallis had to surrender nearly 8,000 soldiers. That basically broke the British will to keep fighting.
So what were the big impacts of America winning independence?
Huge. Firstly, colonists loyal to Britain. The Loyalists, many fled, often north to Canada, changing Canada's makeup. The 13 colonies became the United States of America, a new republic with George Washington as the first president.
And it grew.
Massively. Expanded westward across the continent, which was, of course, disastrous for the Native American populations already living there. The USA became seen as this land of the free, inspiring revolutionaries in France soon after, and reformers in Britain too. But the sources highlight, those ideals of liberty and justice for all in the Declaration. They weren't applied to everyone straight away. Slavery wasn't abolished until 1865, after another terrible civil war. Women couldn't vote nationally until 1920.
So the revolution was for liberty, but not for everyone at first.
Exactly. There were major contradictions. For Britain, losing the colonies was a blow, but they pivoted their empire building elsewhere. India, Australia, Africa. The relationship with France remained terrible, and eventually, of course, the USA grew to become the world's richest and most powerful nation.
The insight there seems to be that challenging a distant power, demanding representation, it can lead to something totally new, a nation founded on radical ideas. But even revolutions fought for liberty can take a long, long time to deliver that liberty to everyone within the new society.
Right. So we've covered a lot of ground there, journeyed through centuries, really.
Yeah.
From Henry VIII taking on the Pope.
Through the Pilgrimage of Grace challenging Henry.
Then Charles I facing Parliament, civil war, and execution.
And finally, the American colonies breaking away completely.
These were all moments when the idea that a monarch's power was absolute and God-given was seriously challenged, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. And thinking about power and the people, for your history studies, you can see how these clashes weren't just political arguments. They involved religion, money, ordinary people's lives, and they had massive, long-lasting consequences that reshaped Britain and influenced the whole world.
Yeah, they weren't just things that happened long ago. They were intense power struggles. People died fighting for what they believed in, whether it was defending the old Catholic faith or demanding no taxation without representation.
We've seen how challenging authority can overturn existing systems, spread incredibly powerful ideas about rights and representation,
Right.
ideas we still talk about today.
Definitely. But we also saw, like with the American Revolution, that even when a challenge succeeds in the name of liberty, that liberty might not be for everyone immediately. It makes you think, doesn't it? What does it really mean to challenge power effectively? And when the system changes, who actually benefits in the end? Who's still left fighting?
It's a crucial question. Something to keep in mind whenever you're looking at struggles for power throughout history and even today. Who wins, who loses, and whose liberty gets prioritized? Worth thinking about.